Imagine sitting at a tavern table in the late 19th or early 20th century, listening to men speak about war and politics, their words heavy with talk of alliances, armies, and weapons. Few would believe you if you leaned over and said, "The spark that sets this whole world ablaze won't be a king, a crown, or a bullet tittle." And yet, history has a way of taking the absurd and making it real. That is exactly what happened. A humble pigeon, a creature more often associated with cooing in city squares or carrying simple messages, became the unwitting match that lit a powder keg of global proportions. To understand why this strange story carries weight, we have to step back. By the late 1800s and into the 1900s, Europe and much of the wider world had been carved into rival alliances. Nations armed themselves to the teeth, pouring resources into standing armies, battleships, and artillery. Tensions were at a constant boil, with colonial rivalries stretching across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In this climate, a single spark, no matter how small, could ignite catastrophe. Most people imagine that spark as an assassination, a political crisis, or an invasion. But sometimes history does not bother with the grandiose. Sometimes it laughs in our faces and gives us a pigeon. The pigeon in question was no ordinary bird. It belonged to the world of carrier pigeons, animals trained for centuries to deliver messages across long distances. Nations relied on them not just in wartime, but for communication in regions where telegraph lines or reliable transport did not exist. The bird, in this case, became tangled in the machinery of espionage, nationalism, and suspicion. It was captured, inspected, and found to be carrying intelligence. That one state interpreted as proof of betrayal. At that moment, what should have been nothing more than a small scandal spiraled into an international crisis. Think of it like this: a room full of men sitting around a table, already drenched in oil and fumes from years of distrust and aggression. The pigeon was simply the lit match that fell on the floor. Once the bird's capture was made public, it was no longer about one animal or one message. It was about the symbolism. Newspapers caught hold of the story and ran with it. Politicians, always eager for justification to push forward aggressive agendas, pointed to this feathered messenger as evidence that the enemy could not be trusted. What had once been whispers of spying now had a body of pigeon as body to parade before the public. And here lies the heart of the absurdity, nor its flight, but of human desperation to find excuses. It is easy to laugh at the idea of men in suits and military uniforms pacing across marble floors and heatedly pointing to a pigeon as the reason for mobilization. Yet when nations are already looking for war, they do not need much. They need only a final nudge. The pigeon provided it. We must not imagine this event in isolation. The pigeon was a part of a chain of causes, a domino in a long line. Behind it lay decades of arms races, colonial rivalries, economic competition, and nationalist fervor. The pigeon became the focal point, the ridiculous face of something much darker. If we see this event as nothing but comedy, we risk missing the terrifying truth that leaders of great empires were willing to seize upon anything, no matter how absurd, to justify bloodshed. Consider for a moment the soldier in the field, unaware of the grand politics behind him. He may have been told he fought for honor, for his people, for the glory of his empire. Would he ever have believed that one of the final sparks came from a pigeon? Or think of the family back home, waving goodbye to sons, brothers, and fathers, having no idea that the war swallowing their lives was in part nudged forward by a bird. This is where the cruelty of history lies in, the disconnect between the absurdity of causes and the weight of consequences. What made the pigeon story so powerful, however, was the way it spread. People laughed, yes, but laughter turned quickly into outrage. The idea of being spied upon through something as common and harmless as a pigeon felt both ridiculous and sinister. It blurred the line between everyday life and the machinery of war. Pigeons were everywhere, perched on rooftops, flying across fields, nesting in barns. To think that even they could be agents of espionage fed into paranoia, and paranoia is one of war's greatest allies. We should not underestimate the role of rumor and perception in this moment. In an age before instant communication, stories took on lives of their own. A pigeon carrying intelligence in one city could, within days, become a symbol of enemy infiltration everywhere. Ordinary citizens, reading their newspapers over morning coffee, saw in that bird not just wings and feathers, but the talons of an enemy stretching into their daily lives. It transformed war from an abstract matter of borders and treaties into something immediate and personal. That is why the pigeon mattered. Even today, when we look back, it feels absurd. How could something so small push the world over the edge? And yet, when all the forces of history align, the smallest trigger can unleash the largest storm. The pigeon did not create the tension, it only released it. It was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire tapestry. And so, as strange as it sounds, we find ourselves telling this story not with irony, but with the gravity it deserves. Because history, at its cruelest, often hides its devastation behind the absurd. A pigeon, a bird no larger than a loaf of bread, carried on its wings the final push that turned rivals into combatants and suspicion into war. That is why this story matters, not because of the bird itself, but because of what it reveals about humanity's hunger for conflict and the dangerous fragility of peace when it rests on foundations of distrust. And if you want more bizarre, unsettling, and unbelievable stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because sometimes the past is so strange you wouldn't believe it if it weren't true. Picture the scene: a borderland already thick with suspicion. Soldiers stationed along watchtowers and diplomats trading cold stares behind closed doors. Into this atmosphere of tension comes the incident of the pigeon's maul in scale. Laughable in ordinary times, but disastrous in a world where every move is read as provocation. Nation, a proud and deeply invested in its military technology, had bred and trained pigeons, not as harmless birds, but as a tool of communication, espionage, and strategy. When one of those prized animals was found dead in Nation B's territory, the act was read not as chance, but as a deliberate insult. For Nation A, the bird was not just a pigeon, it was a soldier. These trained messengers carried intelligence more valuable than gold, linking armies across mountains, rivers, and contested ground. Shooting one down was the equivalent of intercepting a coded dispatch or capturing an officer carrying classified orders. The government of Nation wasted no time in framing the act as aggression. Their newspapers blared headlines about the dishonor of their bird being murdered in foreign skies. Public outrage surged, not just because of the dead pigeon, but because of what it symbolized: a violation of sovereignty and a threat to national pride. Nation B, of course, saw matters differently. From their perspective, the pigeon had crossed into their territory, and not as a harmless intruder. In their eyes, this bird was a spy. The fact that it was intercepted and killed was not an outrage, but a justified act of defense. To let it pass would have been weakness, perhaps even treason. By defending their skies from infiltration, they had safeguarded their people. The clash of narratives turned what should have been a minor misunderstanding into a firestorm. Neither side wanted to appear weak, and both saw backing down as unthinkable. The pigeon became a stand-in for honor itself. Within days, the incident ballooned into a full-blown diplomatic quarrel. Ambassadors stormed out of meetings. Protests filled the streets. What had started as a bird's death became a matter of national survival. The dominoes began to fall quickly. Nation A issued a demand: a formal apology, compensation, and a guarantee that such an act would never happen again. Nation B flatly refused, insisting that they had every right to defend their airspace. Their refusal was reported in Nation A's press as arrogance, as proof that Nation B had planned the entire affair. Rumors spread that the pigeon had been captured alive, interrogated in some secret compound, its message stolen. In reality, no such thing had happened, but truth had already lost its footing. This is where history often reveals its cruel humor. Alliances forged in treaties and backroom deals now activated like clockwork. Nation A, insulted and enraged, leaned on its allies, urging them to stand firm against this affront. Nation B, equally indignant, reminded its own partners that an attack on its sovereignty could not go unanswered. Suddenly, what was once a bird shot out of the sky became a litmus test for entire blocks of nations. To remain neutral was seen as cowardice. To show solidarity meant preparing for war. As the crisis deepened, ordinary people began to feel its weight. In the capital cities of both nations, newspapers ran illustrations of pigeons in military garb, painted as martyrs or villains, depending on which side you read. Children marched in parades carrying paper pigeons as symbols of national pride. Merchants refused to sell goods to foreigners, fearing they might be spies. The pigeon, once a humble messenger, had been elevated into a national symbol of purity, betrayal, and vengeance all at once. The tension grew even sharper at the borders. Patrols doubled and skirmishes broke out. A soldier nervously firing at a shadow in the night might be reported as an enemy advance. When shots were exchanged across disputed lines, officials back in the capitals pointed to these clashes as proof that war had already begun in all but name. Military trains were loaded. Armies mobilized. All of it flowed from the death of one pigeon, an absurd spark feeding a roaring blaze. At diplomatic tables, the situation fared no better. Nation A's representatives refused to sit in the same room as Nation B's delegation unless they admitted fault. Nation B's diplomats walked out of negotiations, furious at the demand for apology. Neutral mediators attempted to calm the storm, but they underestimated the role of pride. When tempers are high and armies are armed, logic gives way to symbolism. Neither nation wanted to be the first to yield, for yielding meant humiliation in the eyes of the world. Consider for a moment the ordinary farmer in Nation B who tended his fields, or the shopkeeper in Nation A who sold bread in the market. They had no hand in the pigeon's flight, no interest in its message. Yet their lives now dangled on the decisions of leaders who saw in that bird an opportunity or an excuse. For them, the pigeon was no longer a trivial animal, but the shadow of war looming on the horizon. By this stage, the domino effect was unstoppable. Border clashes were reported daily. Mobilization orders spread panic. The pigeon incident, still mocked in some circles, had become deadly serious in others. What was at stake was no longer the bird itself, but the fragile balance of power. A single flap of wings had tilted that balance, sending great empires sliding toward confrontation. The absurdity of it all lingers even as the story darkens. Leaders who commanded thousands of soldiers and vast arsenals of weapons chose to gamble peace over the fate of one pigeon. The episode reminds us of a chilling truth. In a world already primed for conflict, the smallest event can tip the scale. The pigeon was never the cause of war, it was simply the trigger. But in a world wired for explosions, even the lightest spark is enough to set everything ablaze. The pigeon may have fallen, but what truly mattered was the ground it landed on. That patch of disputed sky belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. It was here, in the cracks of old grudges and simmering hatred, that the tiny incident took root and grew into something unstoppable. The world of Nation A and Nation B was already fractured, divided into camps that glared at each other across maps, etched with scars of conquest, betrayal, and ambition. In such a world, the death of one bird was never going to remain small. It was destined to be swallowed whole by the machinery of geopolitics. Nation A wasted no time in calling upon its allies. Had long-standing trade agreements and defense pacts with Nation A for them. The pigeon's death was not simply an insult to their friend, it was an opportunity to reaffirm their dominance and to flex their naval strength in a region they had always sought to control. Nation D, another ally, shared a border with Nation B and had its own reasons to step in. Decades earlier, wars had left lines on maps that cut through villages, rivers, and farmland. The grievances never truly healed. The pigeon incident became the excuse they had been waiting for, a chance to settle old debts under the guise of defending honor. On the other side, Nation B did not stand alone. Nation E had long been its protector, the bigger brother who supplied arms, training, and the confidence to defy larger powers. Nation E saw in this crisis a chance to counterbalance Nation A's bloc and to expand its own influence. For them, siding with Nation B wasn't just loyalty, it was strategy. By pushing back against Nation A's demands, they could strengthen their foothold in contested territories and weaken their rivals' influence in the region. This web of alliances was no accident. It had been spun over decades of treaties, backroom promises, and marriages between royal families. But, like all webs, it was fragile and dangerous. Once touched, it vibrated violently, pulling every corner into motion. The pigeon was the touch. Its death set the whole structure quivering. Suddenly, a quarrel between two nations was no longer theirs alone. It became a litmus test for the strength of alliances, a question of loyalty and betrayal, and a spark that drew in powers far larger than the original players. The historical backdrop made peace almost impossible. Nation A and Nation B had clashed countless times before, over borders, over rivers, over resources. Memories of these conflicts lingered like open wounds. Generations had grown up hearing stories of betrayal, massacres, and humiliations inflicted by the other side. When politicians stood before their people to speak about the Pigeon, they weren't just talking about feathers and wings. They were evoking centuries of bitterness, summoning ghosts of past wars to justify the path to another. Territorial disputes added yet another layer. The borderlands between Nation A and Nation B were more than just lines on a map. They were symbols of survival. Farmers tilled soil that had been claimed, lost, and reclaimed countless times. Soldiers patrolled mountains where their grandfathers had died. Every stone, every river crossing carried weight. The Pigeonist fall into such contested ground was not seen as chance, but as fate a sign that destiny demanded confrontation. Diplomacy, under such conditions, was theater. Envoys gathered in glittering halls, but the scripts had already been written. Nation A demanded an apology and reparations, confident that its allies would back it to the end. Nation B refused, equally certain that its protector, Nation E, would never let it bow. Each side spoke not to resolve but to perform, to show their people that they would not bend. Words hardened into ultimatums. Ultimatums hardened into mobilization orders. In the streets of Nation A, crowds cheered as newspapers printed lurid accounts of the Pigeon's mission. Artists sketched heroic depictions of the bird carrying secret messages across enemy skies. Struck down by cowardly fire, children memorized poems about its sacrifice. In Nation B, the same pigeon was mocked as a spy, its death celebrated as proof of vigilance. Farmers painted its image on their barns as a warning to enemies that no intruder would pass unnoticed. What might have been forgotten in days instead became immortalized in symbols, slogans, and songs. The domino effect of alliances made escalation inevitable. Nation C began moving its fleets into contested waters, declaring it a routine exercise. Nation D placed troops on high alert along the shared border with Nation B, claiming it was only a precaution. Nation E responded in kind, sending supplies and military advisors to Nation B. Each move was rationalized as defense, but every move also tightened the noose. To the outside world, the Pigeon had vanished into legend, but the armies it unleashed were real, and they were marching. What's striking in this chain of events is not just the absurdity, but the pattern. History is littered with small sparks that set entire continents ablaze. A crown prince assassinated in Sarajevo, a ship sunk in contested waters, an insult hurled in a royal court. The Pigeon joins that list not because it was mighty, but because it entered a world primed for disaster. When powder fills a room, it takes only the faintest spark to ignite. Inside government halls, cooler heads tried to prevail. Advisors whispered that perhaps reparations could be negotiated quietly, that perhaps the Pigeon's mission was unclear. But by now, neither leader could risk appearing weak. To compromise meant losing face, and in the ruthless calculus of geopolitics, losing face often meant losing power, or even life. And so the Pigeon, voiceless and long dead, dictated policy from beyond the grave. The shifting sands of alliances and rivalries meant that this was never just about two nations. It was about the balance of the entire world. Once the first domino tipped, the others had no choice but to follow. What started with wings ended with war drums. The Pigeon had become irrelevant, but the stage was now set for catastrophe. National pride can be a powerful force, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. Once the Pigeon incident spiraled into international insult, it wasn't just politicians and diplomats who shaped the course of events. It was the people themselves, angry crowds, stirred up by newspapers, pamphlets, and fiery speeches, who demanded action. Every nation involved began to frame the incident as a matter of honor. To do nothing, to remain still, would mean weakness. And in a world where weakness could invite invasion, no leader dared to risk it. In Nation A, headlines screamed of betrayal. The Pigeon was painted not as a mere bird, but as a soldier, a martyr who had carried with it the weight of national secrets and pride. Its death became a symbol of aggression that demanded blood in return. Politicians spoke of justice, but their tone was filled with vengeance. Citizens rallied in squares, shouted for their armies to march. Patriotic songs were sung, and recruitment stations overflowed with young men eager to prove their loyalty. Nation B told its own story. 1. To them, the Pigeon was no innocent courier, but a spy caught red-handed in their skies. Its death was celebrated as proof that their defenses were vigilant, that their sovereignty was unshakable. When Nation A's demands for apology and reparations arrived, they were rejected not only by the government, but by the people themselves. Farmers, factory workers, and scholars all saw capitulation as humiliation. They urged their leaders to stand firm. The press fanned the flames. Satirical cartoons depicted enemy leaders as cowards or warmongers. Stories often circulated of atrocities committed by the rival side, adding fuel to a fire that needed no help burning. In both nations, the public appetite for war grew insatiable, and governments were dragged along by the tide of their people's fury. The Pigeon had been buried, but in its place rose a legend that demanded retribution. Once ultimatums were issued and ignored, the machinery of war roared to life. In Nation, A trains filled with soldiers began to move toward the frontier. Weapons stockpiles were opened, and factories shifted overnight from civilian production to armaments. Horses were conscripted. Fields left empty as farmers donned uniforms, and entire towns became hubs of military activity. Nation C, the naval ally of Nation A, began mobilizing fleets, ordering warships out of ports and into contested waters. Sailors kissed their families goodbye, uncertain if they would ever return. Nation B, far from intimidated, responded in kind. Military parades marched through capital streets, meant both to boost morale and to send a message to enemies abroad. Young men lined up in droves, some out of patriotism, others out of fear of being labeled unpatriotic. Factories ran through the night, churning out rifles, ammunition, and uniforms. Nation E, its powerful ally, sent advisors and shipments of weapons, declaring publicly that any attack on Nation B would be treated as an attack on itself. The stage for a wider conflict was now fully set. Declarations of war came swiftly, like dominoes falling in succession. First, Nation A declared war on Nation B, citing the Pigeon as the spark, but framing it as the culmination of years of aggression. Within hours, Nation C declared war on Nation B as well, citing treaty obligations and the need to defend their ally. Nation D, already itching for a chance to strike at its neighbor, declared war to... In response, Nation E announced it was entering the war on the side of Nation B, bringing with it vast resources and a sprawling empire. Other nations, bound by treaties or drawn by promises of territory, were pulled in almost overnight. What had started as a quarrel over feathers and wings now spread across continents. The military preparations were staggering. Nation C's mighty navy clashed with Nation E's fleets in distant seas, while Nation D's armies surged across mountain passes toward Nation B's borders. Skirmishes that might once have remained local now rippled outward, dragging in colonies, protectorates, and trading partners. Soon the conflict spanned not just the homelands of the nations involved, but their territories abroad, from deserts to jungles to icy seas. What made the escalation unstoppable was the momentum of the war machine itself. Once armies were mobilized, once ships were launched, and once propaganda had convinced millions that their very survival was at stake, there was no turning back. Even if cooler heads had wished to pause, the machinery of mobilization had already consumed too many resources to stop. The nations were locked on a track from which there was no escape. For the soldiers at the front, the Pigeon was a distant and almost laughable memory. Yet for their governments, it remained the official story, the noble justification for why families sent their sons to die. Leaders invoked the Pigeon in speeches, painting it as the first casualty of a righteous struggle. Statues and memorials were even proposed, ensuring the bird would remain immortalized as a symbol of defiance. The absurdity of the trigger mattered less than the reality of the outcome. Trenches were dug, cannons roared. Navies clashed on seas thousands of miles from where the Pigeon had fallen. The public, whipped into frenzy, accepted the war as necessary and inevitable. Nationalist fervor made questioning the cause dangerous. Anyone who asked if it was truly worth it was branded a traitor. The war machine had awakened fully, its gears grinding, its momentum unstoppable, and All the while, the story of the pigeon continued to grow old and retold until it became less a strange accident and more a myth of origin for a war that was no longer just about borders, but about pride, survival, and the reshaping of the world. History is rarely shaped by the events we expect. More often than not, it is the small, absurd, or seemingly trivial incidents that become the spark for catastrophes. The so-called Pigeon War stands as one of those baffling examples, where a bird became the symbol of a world collapsing under the weight of its own tensions. But if we step back, what truly matters is not the pigeon itself, but the environment in which its death mattered at all. A world already brimming with hostility, suspicion, and rigid alliances needed only the smallest nudge to fall into chaos. The pigeon was that nudge, a feather landing on a mountain of dry tinder. The key lesson here is how fragile peace really is when it is built on mistrust. Nations A and B did not go to war because of a bird. They went to war because their relationship had already deteriorated to a breaking point. Old wounds, rivalries, and disputes had simmered for years, perhaps decades. The pigeon was not the cause, but the excuse. This is why absurd catalysts in history carry such weight. They reveal how unstable the world order already was. If it hadn't been the pigeon, it would have been something else. Some other minor incident twisted into a symbol of insult and defiance. Geopolitical scholars often use the term black swan event to describe such moments rare, unpredictable, and deeply impactful. In hindsight, they seem absurdly obvious, but in the moment, no one sees them coming. The Pigeon War fits that mold perfectly. On its own, a pigeon falling from the sky should have been meaningless. In a healthier climate of diplomacy, it might have been resolved with an apology, a fine, or even shrugged off entirely. But in a system of rigid alliances, national pride, and jingoistic fervor, it became the symbol around which nations rallied for war. What is most unsettling is how quickly the absurd becomes accepted when war fever takes hold. The people of Nation A came to see the pigeon as a martyr, a fallen soldier carrying secrets to his death. In Nation B, its downing was celebrated as a bold act of defense. Neither side questioned whether it made sense for millions to fight and die over the fate of a bird. Once the gears of mobilization began to turn, once speeches and newspapers framed the incident as destiny, the truth no longer mattered. The pigeon had become myth, and myths are far more dangerous than facts. The parallels to modern times are hard to ignore. In our interconnected world, with alliances, treaties, and rivalries stretching across continents, the conditions for absurd catalysts still exist. A single drone shot down a cyber attic, even a misinterpreted message could serve the same role as the pigeon once did. The lesson is not to laugh at the past, but to recognize the warning it offers. Wars are not always born from grand causes or monumental grievances. Sometimes they are born from the smallest spark landing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Pigeon War also teaches us about the danger of pride. Neither Nation A nor Nation B could step back without appearing weak. Leaders feared humiliation more than destruction, and in that fear, they locked themselves into a cycle of escalation. This is perhaps the most haunting lesson when pride and honor take precedence over reason and humanity. Peace becomes impossible. Leaders find themselves trapped by the narratives they create, and once those narratives take root among the people, they cannot be undone. It is tempting to dismiss such events as relics of the past, products of a less rational world, but history shows us that human nature has not changed. The Pigeon War, absurd as it may sound, is not about birds at all. It is about us. It is about the ways we allow symbols, pride, and alliances to control our decisions, often with devastating consequences. It is about the fragility of systems that claim to preserve peace, but in reality, create the perfect storm for conflict. Imagine for a moment the families caught in the middle. A farmer in Nation A loses his son to the front lines, never to return. A mother in Nation B sees her town burned, her home destroyed, her children starving. To them, the pigeon means nothing. They suffer not for the bird, but for the politics built upon it. And yet, their suffering becomes part of the myth as well. Absorbed into the narrative of sacrifice and honor, the ordinary people pay the price, while the absurdity of the cause fades into background noise. This is why we cannot afford to ignore such stories, no matter how ridiculous they sound. They remind us that the tipping point between peace and war can be laughably small. A bird? A word? Oh, gestural can set the world ablaze if the conditions are right. And more often than not, those conditions are created not by the event itself, but by years of distrust, rivalry, and unhealed wounds. So when we look back at the Pigeon War, we should not simply laugh at the absurdity. We should shudder at its implications. Because if a pigeon could plunge the world into chaos once, something equally small could do it again. The lesson is not about feathers and wings, but about vigilance, diplomacy, and the need to recognize when pride is leading us toward disaster. And with that, if you found this strange yet sobering dive into history eye-opening, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because sometimes the most absurd stories from the past carry the most important lessons for the future.